In 1948, the United States Air Force funded an aircraft that had no landing gear. This was not an oversight, and it was not a budget cut. The engineers deliberately removed the wheels because this aircraft was never supposed to touch the ground. It would spend its entire operational life living inside another airplane, deploying only when enemy fighters appeared, and returning to its host like a parasite crawling back into its mother. The McDonnell XF-85 Goblin was the smallest jet fighter ever built for the American military. It measured just 4.5 meters long, which made it shorter than a modern SUV. The pilot sat with his knees nearly touching his chest inside a cockpit so cramped that claustrophobia was a job requirement. Getting out of the bomber was easy. The Goblin would drop from the bomb bay, ignite its engine, and fly off to attack enemy interceptors. The problem was getting back in. Redocking with the mothership meant flying directly into a wall of violent turbulence while trying to hook onto a metal trapeze swinging beneath a bomber traveling at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Test pilots called it threading a needle during an earthquake, and most of them failed. This is the story of the strangest, most dangerous, and most fascinating failure in aviation history. The Convair B-36 Peacemaker was the largest bomber ever built, and it had one job: deliver nuclear weapons to the Soviet Union. If World War III ever started, this aircraft was a monster. 6 piston engines faced backward in a pusher configuration, and 4 jet engines were added later for extra speed during critical moments. The wingspan stretched over 70 meters, longer than a Boeing 747. It could fly from Texas to Moscow without landing, which made it the ultimate weapon of nuclear deterrence. But the B-36 had a fatal weakness. It was slow. American intelligence knew the Soviets were developing fast jet interceptors like the MiG-15. If war came, the B-36 would be flying through hostile airspace for hours, and enemy fighters would tear it apart long before it reached its target. The obvious solution was fighter escort. Send jets alongside the bomber to protect it from interceptors. And that's when the Air Force ran into a wall of physics that nobody could solve. Early jet fighters burned fuel at ridiculous rates. They had combat ranges measured in hundreds of kilometers, not thousands. A fighter could take off with the bomber, but it would run dry before reaching enemy territory, leaving the B-36 alone and defenseless exactly when it needed protection most. Aerial refueling technology existed in primitive form, but it was unreliable and complicated. The Pentagon needed another answer, and someone proposed an idea that sounded insane. What if the bomber carried its own fighters inside its body and released them only when the enemy appeared? The logic was simple. If fighters cannot fly far enough on their own, let the bomber carry them. The B-36 had a massive bomb bay designed to hold nuclear weapons. That same space could theoretically hold a small fighter aircraft. When Soviet interceptors appeared on radar, the bomber would release its parasite fighter to engage and destroy them. After the threat was eliminated, the fighter would return to the bomber and redock for the rest of the journey. No runways needed, no fuel limitations. The escort would travel inside the bomber like cargo until the moment it was needed. McDonnell Aircraft Corporation won the contract to build this parasite fighter, and their engineers immediately faced an impossible challenge. The aircraft had to be small enough to fit inside the bomb bay, powerful enough to fight Soviet jets, and capable of redocking with a moving bomber at high altitude. Every conventional design rule had to be thrown away. Normal fighters were long and sleek for stability. This one had to be short and compact to fit in the space available. Normal fighters had landing gear for emergencies. This one would have no wheels at all because the weight and space could not be spared. The result was the XF-85 Goblin, and It looked like nothing anyone had ever seen before. If you're new here and want more stories about insane military engineering projects, hit that subscribe button now. The XF-85 Goblin looked less like a fighter and more like an egg with wings. The entire aircraft measured only 4.5 meters from nose to tail. A Westinghouse J-34 turbojet engine occupied most of the internal space, which left barely enough room for a pilot, fuel tanks, and 4 M3 Browning machine guns in the nose. The cockpit was so cramped that the pilot sat with his knees bent toward his chest. There was no room to stretch, no room to move, and no room for the bulky ejection seats that other jets were starting to use. If something went wrong, the pilot had one option: open the canopy and try to bail out manually while the aircraft tumbled through the sky. The wings were designed with a folding mechanism that allowed them to sweep upward like an insect tucking its wings against its body. This let the Goblin fit inside the bomb bay with just enough clearance to avoid scraping the walls. A massive vertical stabilizer stuck up from the rear of the fuselage, and 2 smaller fins angled downward beneath the tail. This unusual configuration was necessary because the aircraft was so short that it would otherwise be dangerously unstable. Short aircraft are inherently twitchy. Every control input produces an exaggerated response, and the Goblin was the shortest jet fighter ever built. But the most radical design choice was what the aircraft lacked entirely. There was no landing gear, no wheels, no skids, no pontoons. The Goblin had a small steel skid plate on its belly for emergency ground contact, but this was a last resort that would destroy the aircraft. Under normal operations, the Goblin would never touch the ground. It would deploy from the bomber, complete its mission, and return to dock with the trapeze system that held it in place. The only question was whether any of that would actually work. The trapeze was a mechanical arm that extended downward from the B-36 bomb bay, and it held the Goblin in place using a hook system that looked deceptively simple. Before flight, the Goblin would be attached to the trapeze while the bomber sat on the runway. The pilot would climb into the cramped cockpit, run through his checks, and wait in darkness inside the bomb bay while the B-36 took off and climbed to altitude. When they reached the operational area, the bomb bay doors would open, and the trapeze would lower the Goblin into the airstream. The pilot would start the jet engine, confirm all systems were functioning, and release from the hook to drop away and begin flying independently. This part worked beautifully. Deployment was smooth, reliable, and relatively safe. The nightmare began when it was time to come home. To recover the Goblin, the pilot had to fly beneath the B-36, match its speed exactly, extend a hook from the top of his own aircraft, and snag the trapeze while both aircraft traveled at over 300 kilometers per hour. The margin for error was measured in centimeters. The Goblin's hook had to catch a small metal loop on the trapeze, miss by a hand's width, and the fighter would bounce off the bomber's fuselage. Miss by more than that, and the aircraft could collide with the bomb bay doors, the engines, or the tail section. And that assumed perfect conditions. What the engineers did not fully understand was the aerodynamic chaos waiting beneath a bomber the size of the B-36. A bomber the size of the B-36 does not move cleanly through the air. It punches a hole in the atmosphere and leaves chaos in its wake. Massive vortices spin off the wingtips. Turbulent air rolls beneath the fuselage. The entire area directly below the bomber is filled with unpredictable currents that push, pull, and shake anything that enters them. The engineers knew there would be some turbulence. They did not realize it would be nearly impossible to fly through. When test pilot Edwin Schock attempted the first free flight recovery, he discovered something terrifying. As the Goblin approached the B-36 from below, the compressed air between the two aircraft created an invisible cushion that pushed the smaller jet away. This was called the bow wave effect, and it fought against every attempt to close the distance. When shock forced through the bow wave, he entered the turbulence zone directly beneath the bomber. The Goblin bucked and twisted violently. Control inputs that would normally produce smooth responses instead threw the aircraft in random directions. Trying to hook the trapeze in these conditions was like trying to thread a needle while riding a mechanical bull. The pilot had to compensate for forces he could not predict, aim for a target that was swinging in the disturbed air, and do all of this while maintaining precise speed matching with the bomber above. Schoch was one of the best test pilots in America. He had thousands of hours of flight time and nerves that nothing could shake, and even he could barely make it work. The first free flight recovery attempt ended in failure, and it almost ended in death. Edwin Schoch, released from the trapeze, flew the Goblin through its performance tests and then attempted to redock. As he entered the turbulence beneath the B-36, the aircraft became nearly uncontrollable. He fought the stick, trying to keep the nose pointed at the swinging trapeze, but the currents kept throwing him off course. On his first approach, he missed the hook entirely. On his second approach, the turbulence slammed the Goblin upward into the trapeze with brutal force. The impact shattered the cockpit canopy and ripped the flight helmet off Schoch's head. He was now flying a damaged aircraft with no landing gear, no canopy, and wind blasting directly into his face at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Schoch did not panic. He pulled away from the bomber, assessed his situation, and made the only decision available. He would attempt an emergency landing in the desert below using the small steel skid plate on the Goblin's belly. The aircraft hit the dry lake bed at high speed, throwing up a massive cloud of dust as it slid across the sand. Metal screamed against the ground. The Goblin shook violently as it decelerated. And then it stopped. Schoch climbed out alive. The aircraft was damaged but not destroyed. The test program would continue, but the message was clear. This was not going to be easy. If you're still watching, subscribing takes 1 second and helps more content like this get made. 7 free flight recovery attempts were made during the entire XF-85 test program. Only 3 of them succeeded. The other 4 ended in aborted approaches, violent turbulence encounters, and emergency landings in the desert. The test pilots were among the most skilled aviators in the world, flying in perfect weather conditions with full technical support from the ground. They had no combat stress, no battle damage, no fatigue from hours of flight. And still, they failed more often than they succeeded. The Air Force did the math and understood what the numbers meant. If elite pilots barely achieved a 43% success rate under ideal conditions, what would happen to a young combat pilot? Someone who had just fought off Soviet interceptors, whose aircraft might be damaged, who was exhausted after hours of flight, who might be attempting recovery at night or in bad weather. The answer was obvious. They would die. The Goblin concept was not just difficult, it was operationally suicidal. The Air Force could not build a fighter program around an aircraft that had less than a coin flip chance of returning to its mothership. And while the test program struggled, engineers were perfecting a completely different solution to the escort problem. The Goblin was not the only attempt to attach fighters to bombers. Project Phycon went even further, mounting full-sized Republic F-84 Thunderjets to the wingtips of B-36 bombers. The theory was that the fighters could ride along for the long cruise portion of the mission, release near enemy territory, and reattach for the flight home. The results were even worse than the Goblin tests. The aerodynamic interaction between the bomber and the wingtip-mounted fighters created handling problems that endangered both aircraft. Pilots reported that the combined formation was unstable and unpredictable. And when engineers attempted to develop a belly-mounted recovery system similar to the Goblin's trapeze, they encountered the same turbulence problems that had plagued the smaller aircraft. One FICON test ended in a mid-air collision when the F-84 struck the B-36 during a recovery attempt. The crews survived. But the incident proved that the parasite concept was fundamentally flawed regardless of the aircraft size. The physics simply would not cooperate. The turbulent air beneath a bomber could not be eliminated or predicted well enough to make redocking safe. Every variation of the concept encountered the same wall, but by 1949, none of this mattered anymore. The solution to the escort problem turned out to be much simpler than anyone expected. Instead of carrying fighters inside bombers, the Air Force developed reliable aerial refueling technology. A tanker aircraft would fly alongside fighters, extend a hose or boom, and pump fuel directly into their tanks, while both aircraft continued flying. This extended fighter range indefinitely. A jet that could normally fly 800 kilometers could now cross oceans. Escorts could accompany bombers all the way to their targets and all the way home. The problem that created the Goblin was solved completely. Aerial refueling was boring. It was not dramatic. It did not involve tiny aircraft dropping from bomb bays like something from a science fiction film, but it worked. And in military engineering, working beats spectacular every single time. The XF-85 program was canceled in October 1949. The two prototypes that had been built, serial numbers 46-523 and 46-524, were retired from flight testing and eventually sent to museums. The Goblin had flown only a handful of times. It never fired its weapons in combat. It never defended a bomber from enemy interceptors. And it never successfully solved the problem it was designed to address. But that does not mean it was worthless. The Goblin taught engineers lessons that would shape military aviation for decades. The turbulence problems encountered during the test program led to extensive research on wake vortices and the aerodynamic effects of formation flying. This research eventually contributed to safer refueling procedures, better understanding of aircraft, spacing, and improved designs for aircraft that needed to operate in close proximity. The compact engine installation pioneered in the Goblin influenced later designs for small jet aircraft and drones. The folding wing mechanism demonstrated techniques that would be adapted for carrier-based naval fighters. And the fundamental concept of a parasite aircraft did not die. It evolved. Today, the United States military is developing drone swarms that launch from larger aircraft. The C-130 Hercules can deploy dozens of small unmanned vehicles that conduct reconnaissance, electronic warfare, or strike missions before either returning to base or expending themselves against targets. These modern parasites solve the problem that killed the Goblin. They do not need to redock. They either return to friendly airfields on their own, or they are cheap enough to be expendable. The turbulence problem that made the trapeze system deadly simply does not apply when the parasite does not need to come home. The Goblin was the wrong solution at the wrong time. But the thinking behind it eventually led to capabilities that are reshaping modern warfare. The McDonnell XF-85 Goblin flew only a handful of times, and it never worked the way its designers intended. Test pilots risked their lives attempting to redock with a bomber while fighting through turbulence that no one had fully predicted. They succeeded less than half the time under perfect conditions, and everyone understood that combat conditions would be far worse. The project was canceled when aerial refueling made the parasite concept obsolete. The two prototypes ended up in museums, where they still sit today as reminders of an era when engineers refused to accept that any problem was unsolvable. The Goblin was a failure, but it was a spectacular failure, built with brilliant engineering and tested by pilots with courage that defied logic. Sometimes the craziest ideas teach us the most. The Goblin showed what was possible, what was impossible, and where the line between them actually falls. It pushed the boundaries of physics until the physics pushed back. The tiny fighter that lived inside a bomber never saw combat. But it earned its place in history anyway. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel exists for. Subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment with your thoughts on whether the parasite concept could ever work with modern technology.